Welcome, and thank you for joining us for the second panel of 9/11 in Asia, 2 decades later, our virtual conference marking the official launch of Diplomatic Risk Intelligence, the magazine's research and consulting division. I'm Sebastian Strangio, the Southeast Asia editor at The Diplomat, and I'm delighted to be hosting today's panel, which will focus on the impacts and legacies of 9/11 and the global war on terror on the nations of Southeast Asia. Be sure to check out our other 2 panels, which explore the impacts of the war on terror in China and the nations of Central Asia. 20 years since it was launched, the global war on terror has had a profound impact on the world. The horrifying attacks of 9/11 spurred sweeping changes in the way the United States, its partners, and its adversaries use the machinery of state and technology to respond to threats. In the United States itself, the war on terror eroded civil liberties and prompted the US to involve itself in 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that have cost the country dearly in blood and treasure. In his new book, Reign of Terror, the American journalist Spencer Ackerman sketches a direct line between the policies introduced as part of the global war on terror and the increasing polarization of American politics, arguing that this cleared the path for Donald Trump's rise to the White House in 2016. The impact further afield has been similarly profound, yet in some senses more complex. In Southeast Asia, the focus of our discussion today, the global war on terror reframed American relations with the region and shaped the approach that many nations in the region took toward combating the challenge of Islamic extremism. It also provided a framework that nations and actors in the region could repurpose to advance their own interests. Southeast Asia is a particularly important part of the global picture of Islamic extremism. It is home to the world's largest Muslim majority nation, Indonesia, 2 other Muslim majority nations in Brunei and Malaysia, and others with significant Muslim minorities. And all of these have faced, to some extent, or to varying extents, the challenge of Islamic extremism. 2 Southeast Asian nations, the Philippines and Thailand, are also home to long-running Islamic separatist insurgencies that have intersected to varying extents with global Islamist currents. And like Osama bin Laden and those who planned and carried out the 9/11 attacks, leading Southeast Asian militants took part in the formative struggle against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan in the 1980s, an experience that they carried back to their own nations in the years subsequent. In recent years, too, the even more radical vision propounded by the Islamic State has found a small but disturbing number of adherents in Southeast Asian countries, some of whom have undertaken hijra, or migration, to the war zones of Syria and Afghanistan. The legacy of the global war on terror is therefore one that has a dual significance, both for the nations of Southeast Asia and for the wider world. For our examination of its complex legacy in Southeast Asia and where the region might be heading in the years to come, we're very privileged to be joined by 3 leading experts in the field today. Our first speaker will be Dr. Bilvir Singh, an adjunct senior fellow at the Center of Excellence for National Security at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, and associate professor at the Department of Political Science at the National University of Singapore. Bilveer's current research interests include the management of Islamic terrorism in Southeast Asia, various security issues in Indonesia, including the challenge posed by separatism in Papua, and the role of great powers in Southeast Asia. He also wrote an article for the most recent edition of the Diplomat's magazine, focusing on exactly the question we will be examining today, the impact and legacy of the global war on terror in Southeast Asia. Next in line is Dr. Zachary Abuza, a professor at the National War College in Washington, D.C., where he focuses on a range of topics, including Southeast Asian politics and security issues, governance, insurgencies, democratization and human rights, and maritime security. Zachary is the author of 4 books, 3 of which bear directly on today's topic. He also authored the Southeast Asia chapter in the acclaimed study, Leaving Terrorism Behind, which examines the processes by which individuals and groups disengage from terrorism and violent extremism. And rounding out our trio of experts is Dr. Jolene Gerard, who is also an adjunct senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at NTU, who specializes in terrorist and extremist groups in Southeast Asia. Her career has taken her to a long list of nations, including Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Somalia, Yemen, the southern Philippines, the southern Thailand, and the insurgent areas of Bangladesh. And she's also the executive director at Sentinel, a public safety and management consultancy firm. Before we get started, I just want to offer a quick note on the format today. I'll be inviting each of the 3 panelists to speak for about 10 minutes on various aspects of the day's topic. at which point we will move to a moderated discussion about various other aspects of the question at hand. So without further ado, I am delighted to invite Dr. Bilvir Singh, the first of our three panelists, to kick off our proceedings by offering some initial thoughts on today's topic.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, and it's really a privilege to be part of this panel. I think to get to the core of the issue, by any measure, I think 9/11 and the global war on terror was a fundamental defining moment in this part of the world. In political science, we talk about the securitization of almost every issue here, whether political, economic, and especially security. The security landscape changed totally. Not that there were no terrorist groups prior to this, they were, but the difference was they tended to be very national based. Afghanistan changed this following the Soviet invasion, and then the whole concept of the whole of Mujahideen to bring the Soviet invasion down or to reverse it created a kitchen whereby these guys came together, and out of that came the morphing into Al-Qaeda, believing that they have won against a superpower, they could go back home and repeat the same thing in each of the countries in this part of the world. That created the Jama'ah Islamiyah, the affiliate of Al-Qaeda in this part of the world. And whatever they learned, they carried out the training, and most important, ideologically, they came back and they carried out a series of bombing beginning the year 2000, fundamentally, in Indonesia. And that actually went on till 2009 in Indonesia, but in the Philippines, it continued. The point about this whole exercise is that for the first time, we have a region-wide terrorist group called Al-Jama'ah al-Islamiyah. But number two, the whole concept of what is jihadism here got removed. It is no more a region, no more a national thing. It's no more just a regional thing. It's part and parcel of a global emirate or caliphate later on. So I think 9/11 and GWOT fundamentally altered the whole thinking about this problem, this monster called terrorism, even though primarily this time it was Islamist terrorism. We have got issues with Buddhists, Hindu, Sikh, Christian in this part of the world. This brings me to the focus about Indonesia, the largest and the most important country in this part of the world. In Afghanistan, though they started late, but they became the primary players in Pakistan and Afghanistan, even though the Filipinos were quite big, but the leadership, the thinking, the ideological gelling led to the creation of what eventually became the JI. And they organized themselves for the first time on a region-wide basis. Indonesia was the major area of operation, and hence the series of violence which we saw there. What is following this is interesting. How did the governments in the region respond, primarily in Indonesia? Interesting, until Bali 1 happened, the Indonesian government remained in denial that such a thing could exist, that it's a CIA conspiracy, it's a Singapore conspiracy, and so on and so forth. Eventually, they discovered the footprints of JI and what they were doing, and so on and so forth. And that led to a series of responses, among others, hard and soft measures, but most importantly, organizing the state. Don't mind you, this is an Islamic majority country where Islamic politics and democratizing Indonesia is so important. So they set up first a bomb unit at the desk of the Coordinating Ministry for National Security. And then we have got Densus 88 with the help of the US, Australia, UK, and BNPT, the National Counterterrorist Agency. To the credit of Indonesia, I think using legal mechanism as well as non-legal, they succeeded actually in degrading JI. And after 2009, the JI leadership, most of whom were either killed or behind bars, took the new position that we are not going to have any more bombing in Indonesia until such time we are ready. This actually harked back to what was happening in JI way back in the 1990s, following the death of his founder leader, Abdullah Sungkar. So today, or from 2009, 2010 till today, the JI is probably the most powerful terror group in terms of organization in Indonesia, but still largely no bomb. But what complicated the scene was the birth of IS in Iraq, Syria, and Indonesians of different shades and sizes. One who wanted to do killing and action decided to go there. Number two, many found the JI feminine. Why aren't you fighting? So to fight, they moved over to to ISIS, and hence we saw a series of violence, especially from 2016 till today, because if AQ had an affiliate called JI, IS has an affiliate called JAD, Aman Abdurrahman, and this is one of the most violent outfit today. So what has changed in the landscape is this. 911 and GWOT gave birth to one big mantra of a terrorist group called Al-Qaeda. Today, we have got two competing terrorist groups, ideologically very different, leadership-wise very different, and there's competition. AQ is still there in terms of organization. So the question to ask will be, as we follow later on, what does the victory of Taliban and associated with the AQ means for us? But IS is here, and how will they react? Will they be pushed back? Remains to be seen. One last point is this. Rightly or wrongly, the Indonesian counter-terrorist community and leaders thought after 2014, they could use JI to counter IS in Indonesia. Hence, many of the ex-leaders became national celebrities on television and elsewhere. People like Aman Abdurrahman, Abu Rusdan, the former Amir of JI, is a free man, is a powerful individual, influential individual, and they keep using him to contest and counter IS. Now, is this a wise or non-wise policy? You can debate about it. But so today we have got a twin structure. Your twin towers in New York, we have got twin terror groups in this part of the world, especially in Indonesia. In Philippines, we saw them coming up through Marawi. It's still there. But since we are talking about Indonesia, I think we need to watch what happened, 911, GWOT, and where we are today with the re-emergence of the Taliban in Afghanistan. I think I'll stop here and then we'll continue. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Bilveer. It offers us some interesting insights into how things have developed in Indonesia. I want to hand it over to Zach now to, examine. I mean, Zachary, you've focused a lot of your research on the insurgencies in southern Thailand and the southern Philippines. Can you offer some insights on how these governments have approached their separatist insurgencies and how they've reacted to the global war on terror, and if and where these differ from the Indonesian example?
Yeah, let me first begin by saying these are my own views and not the views of the Department of Defense. With that said, look, both countries have long-standing insurgencies. In the southern Thailand, the insurgency dates back to the late 1950s, in the southern Philippines to the late 1960s. And yet the governments responded to these conflicts quite differently. The first thing is that in southern Thailand, despite some efforts by Jemaah Islamiyah, especially cells out of Malaysia, they were never really able to graft onto the existing insurgencies there. They allowed them to pass through, they sold weapons, but it was not an organization that was really interested in being part of a global jihadist struggle. The insurgents in southern Thailand really just wanted their own homeland. They did not want to be under the Siamese kafir. Now, the Thais did provide some very important assistance to the United States during the war on terror. And in particular, three of the most important al-Qaeda leaders in Southeast Asia were arrested in Thailand. And this is important because Thailand wanted, the United States and Thailand's alliance has often, since the end of the Cold War, been in a period of strategic drift. And I think it's important that the Thais play up the importance of the intelligence and law enforcement cooperation. Those are really important pillars of the relationship. So Thailand dealt with that. But then in 2004, their insurgency rekindled. And they've had mixed success. There have been over 7,000 people killed in the heart of mainland Southeast Asia. For periods of time, it really looked pretty ungoverned in Thailand's deep south. But they've gotten a handle on it. Violence is down. But the core of the problems, the grievances of the people, continue to go unmet. And so this will be a festering problem. It's not going to be a major problem, but a festering problem in Thailand. things were really different in the southern Philippines. There you had various different groups out there. In the largest one was the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, but we also had the Abu Sayyaf group. And both of those organizations allied themselves with Al-Qaeda. They were getting seed money. The Al-Qaeda operatives were there setting up training camps in MILF territory, simply because it was too expensive to get Southeast Asians all the way to Pakistan into Afghanistan for training. Al-Qaeda set up a lot of charities and front organizations in the southern Philippines. So the roots and the foundations of a terrorist organization were much deeper there. The Moro Islamic Liberation Front made no secret of their ties to Al-Qaeda pre-9/11. They needed assistance for their struggle for an independent homeland. After 9/11, things got a little harder for them to maintain that relationship. And there was a lot of international pressure on them, but there was international pressure on the Philippines to try to resolve the conflict. And, you know, by 2003, a peace process was begun. It takes many, many years before it's concluded in 2014 and implemented by 2018 and 2019. So things are better on that front. But the Philippines has really continued a very militarized response to the insurgencies in southern part of the country. This always produces collateral damage. There's a lot of artillery fire. This has never been an intelligence-led or a law enforcement-led counter-terrorist operations the way it was in Indonesia, where it was so effective. The Americans used and built on existing Philippine institutions, which sadly were riddled with corruption and had just horrific human rights records. In Indonesia, we helped build up a very effective counterterrorism police force that was free of corruption, that had high levels of esprit de corps and professionalism and fantastic leadership. So America has struggled there. And of course, we've also created moral hazard in that we continue to support the Philippines. We've given them well over $2 billion in counterterrorism assistance. And yet the region is awash in groups that are either pro-Al-Qaeda or defected and joined the Islamic State. As Bilveer mentioned, they took over the city of Marawi and held off the US-trained Philippine military for over 5 months, a total humiliation. And so there have been real weaknesses in the southern Philippines. The Philippines remains a draw and will continue to remain a draw for militants around the region. You can be a supporter of Jemaah Islamiyah or the JAD in Jakarta. What you cannot do, you might be able to launch a terrorist attack, but what you cannot do is control territory. Same thing in Malaysia. And that's why the Philippines continues to be a draw to this day. It will always attract militants because there are enough groups out there, and there's still, if not large swaths of ungoverned space, significant amounts of territory that is very poorly governed. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Zachary. It's an interesting point of comparison to the example of Indonesia. I want to turn to Dr. Jolene Gerard now. Jolene, you wrote an interesting article recently following the Taliban's reconquest of Afghanistan, arguing that, you know, that its reconquest could create a new icon of success for global extremism that might have that might resonate in Southeast Asia. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, what you think the impact of this significant event will be on, you know, the landscape of extremism in Southeast Asia?
Sure. Thank you very much, Stephanie. It's an honor to be part of this panel as well. I think let me just take it back a little. When I was initially, and you were referencing the article, when I was initially trying to think of that exact question in terms of implications to the Taliban's return to Afghanistan, or yesterday's announcement, for example, of its 33-member cabinet, what it means in terms of implications to regional threat groups. Certainly, I sort of positioned that initial article when I thought about it. In 2008, I remember one of my first trips into Kabul, and it was like an Afghan adage that was thrown and tossed about in a lot of the conversations on the ground, be it with analysts, be it with government, be it with people working within the security sectors, or even almost in jest with former Afghan warlords. This concept of you have the watch, I have the time, was often built into the conversation. I think for me, then it spoke in 2008. It spoke to the fact that foreign presence was ultimately temporal, that it was ultimately temporary when the infrastructures were built. The foreign presence would ultimately leave Afghanistan. But I think today that same words, as I reflect, you have the watch and I have the time, to me, it represents this posture of perseverance, this idea that if you wait for an opportune time and you are willing to wait it out, it would be an opportune time for them not only to initiate a comeback, but today that same phrase represents almost a sense of vindication that this sense of waiting throughout, waiting at the sidelines, ultimately could pay off. So today, as I sort of reflect on the implications to the region, certainly when we were looking at the sheer speed through which the Taliban was able to garner territory at an exponential pace, certainly plummeting morale, rushed policies maybe to get out of Afghanistan, the rushed Doha Peace Agreement in 2020, as well as simultaneously what was happening on the ground, where we saw this desire to press on with a withdrawal coincide with the Taliban's ratcheting up of civilian attacks on the ground, targeted assassinations aimed to intimidate civil society. And those reports were coming out from the UN and the UN Security Council at the same time. So this domino effect certainly has had and will continue to have a geostrategic implication. And this underscores, I think, the anxieties as we within the region watch as the Taliban government sort of anchors itself and what it means for regional non-state actors on the ground. So earlier the presentation focused also on the role of these state actors, but where the non-state actors are concerned, where the groups on the ground are concerned, certainly implications for Southeast Asia can also be seen in terms of Al-Qaeda networks, Al-Qaeda aligned networks within the region being strengthened. For example, you're looking at the playing out between the Al-Qaeda aligned groups as well as the terrorist group, the Islamic State aligned groups playing out within our region as well. So it's certainly a sobering backdrop where we are looking at this anchoring that's taking place, even as the cabinet was announced. Certainly we're looking at the fact that in the immediate aftermath of the Taliban taking over, even on the 16th of August, Al-Qaeda supporters had already started rejoicing at the Taliban takeover, naming it a watershed victory. All this is happening in line with also earlier reports that were beginning to surface and warnings by the UN Security Council of Al-Qaeda's growing capacity under the Taliban umbrella. So while the worry would be here that it would continue to provide a permissive environment for Al-Qaeda to ultimately flourish, at the same time, you're also looking at the fact that Al-Qaeda continues to see Afghanistan as a critical base for operations. And certainly as analysts, we're watching as we see this relationship potentially become more pronounced in the months ahead. Where the worry comes is this opportunity where we've seen in the past, and certainly while we hark back to what had happened in the past, where Afghanistan was used as a place for training and building. It's this sobering backdrop that we are all very wary of, where we fear history repeating itself, enabling both terrorist and extremist groups to regroup and rebuild in Afghanistan. This historical linkage with Afghanistan for Southeast Asian terrorist and extremist groups have always been very much entrenched. This included the fact that several batches from Southeast Asia were sent to Afghanistan to train. So individuals like Hambali, who was arrested in Thailand, for example, had facilitated JI's Afghan training. You're looking at the likes of Abdul Rajak Janjalani, the leader of the Abu Sayyaf group, for example, having their own members also go into Afghanistan to train at that point in time. These experiences for many of them who had gone from Southeast Asia then to fight in Afghanistan during the Soviet-Afghan War had certainly left an indelible mark on much of their experiences on the ground, what they brought to the region, and ultimately, I think what Professor Bilveer was speaking of as well, the idea that today it has become almost an area where they would use it as a launchpad to talk about their experiences on the ground. So Afghanistan certainly is very much tied in to how the groups in its nascent days and earlier years had seen its manifestation on the ground, especially in terms of regrouping and rebuilding. In the immediate aftermath, on the 17th of August, just days after, Abu Bakr Bashir's son issued congratulatory note, an official congratulatory note from JAS, Jama'ah Ansharu Sharia, congratulating the Taliban, and in his official note referencing them as brothers in arms. The challenge is, as we are looking at these shifts and changes as they sort of manifest on the ground, and we are looking at its ripple effects in the region, we are also well aware, certainly, that the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, as well as the terrorist group, the Islamic State, while all being radical terrorist groups, they also have their differences in terms of doctrine and ideology and interpretations from within. Certainly, these clashes have become pronounced a bit online, where there was chatter with IS-aligned Indonesian supporters labeling the Taliban as apostate, seeding doubt of the Taliban's ability to implement Sharia law, or even critiquing the fact that the Taliban had a solely nationalist agenda as opposed to the Islamic State's more global agenda. The fears here would be what I had sort of positioned where I called the strategy of strategic patience. Scholars had always referred to it as the long game, or the idea of the infinite strategy, the long game and waiting it out. And I think that today, as we take a step back to reflect 20 years on, groups such as Jamaah Islamiyah, which was initially critiqued as they went into a phase of regrouping, what they had called Idad, or preparation for warfare, and groups that were more IS aligned or Islamic State groups in the region were looking to them and saying, you're not being active enough. Today, the Taliban's victory represents for them that vindication, that preparation, or taking that step back to regroup may yield some level of success in the future. It offers them a sense of validation, certainly fueling sentiments of reward for perseverance ultimately, and the notion that regardless of the runway ahead, divine intervention can culminate in victory over the enemy. And it's that sort of discourse that we're seeing on the ground at the moment. Coupled with that is this challenge of what IS had used then, the breaking of walls strategy. We had seen that used with the Taliban as well, when they had begun freeing prisoners who in turn would lend their skill sets and help build their ranks. In Kabul, in Afghanistan, for example, more than 5,000 prisoners were freed by the Taliban after the storming of the US Air Base facility, where you saw approximately 7 Indonesian fighters who had joined the Islamic State in Afghanistan were also freed in the process. So the challenge would be, as we look at this, the implications of what would be happening, I think that's where we reflect on these shifts and these nuances and its implications for our region amidst not only where you're looking at the COVID pandemic and its implications on the ground here with the threat groups, you're also looking at this calls for support, the older guard within the groups here who have sort of aggregated themselves into what was then known as the Afghan Alumni Network, sending congratulatory notes, all of this in terms of them having some level of vindication in terms of a moral victory that they sort of position themselves. So I would leave it at that here. as I conclude this part, to give a broad overview, certainly this vindication for moral victory has meant that while we are looking at the region and it shifts with the non-state actors, things like the transformative power of technology and what it yields for the groups here, continued radicalization on the ground, innovative strategies between groups where they learn from each other, the dense cross-pollination of ideas, be it between non-state actors present here, be it within terrorist and extremist groups and criminal networks, as well as we look forward to things and as we look to the future of evolving trends, what it means in terms of possible new trade crafts. And of course, a reflection and a revisiting and a poignant reminder of the need to continue to build trusted networks within the Southeast Asian region. Thank you.
Thank you, Jolene. So before we move to sort of some of the questions I had prepared, Zach and Bilveer, do you have anything to add to Jolene's thoughts about the impact of the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban on Southeast Asia? Is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd like to say a few things. One, I think when we look from the region, there is actually a fundamental difference between the Muslim majority and the Muslim minority states in the region. I think Zach talked about Philippines, Thailand, but I think the Muslim majority responses, partly because of the ecosystem in which they are operating, is fundamentally different. And while the focus would remain Malaysia, Indonesia, I think at the same time we watched Thailand and Philippines. I think we must understand at the same time and appreciate that the mechanics is very, very different. Number two, I think Jolene and Zach alluded to this, and I think this is important. The historical relationship over the last 40 years between Southeast Asia and Afghanistan, be it in terms of military operation, be it in terms of sanctuaries, and be it in terms of their links with Al-Qaeda, which was eventually translated into ideological, personal exchanges, combat training, similar Sunni outlook, global jihad. I think these points are important. And finally, the targeting, whether it's far enemy and near enemy. I think these things need to be factored in as we talk about moving forward. Is this really Taliban? Is this Taliban 1.5, Taliban 2.0? Is this tactical for the time being until such time that they will go back to what they were in the past? I think these issues needs to be examined, and it's good to go back and see where is it plausible that they will move forward like that, or has the Taliban actually reinvented itself? Having been demolished so badly, even though it survived, will they repeat the same thing? Will they want the US to come back again? Will they want to lose the kind of games they are playing? And final point is this: their behavior thus far indicate, at least tactically to me, a slight change. The way they manage the social media, the way they're managing the great powers, and most importantly, the way they are managing even their women and education, but most important, the way they are managing the minorities, be it the Hazaras, be it the Sikhs, be it the Hindus. There is a difference. My question is how long? And I think once we can answer that, I take the point that let's be cautious, don't throw everything out to the wind, but there is something which is different. Will it go back, or will they, for survival, economic, political reason, change? And last point, unlike the past, we have China here today as a major player in Afghanistan. And the Chinese, other than economics, their paranoia is Xinjiang. Their worry is, will Al-Qaeda, will ISIS, or whoever be a major player in their soft underbelly? I think it's a big question to watch out for. And these things, we have no immediate answers, but let's watch and see. Thank you.
Zach, any thoughts? Or
yeah, just a quick one. I would agree with something Bilveer said in his opening remarks, and that is JI today is stronger than it probably has ever been in terms of its resources, its size. The Indonesian government gave it ample room to operate, to run their mosques, their madrasas, their charities, their corporations, because they really believed that it was an off-ramp, that if they gave it. They never renounced violence. This is a tactical lull. And, they've been letting the Islamic State take the body blows from the government security forces since 2014. But I think I differ a little bit with both Jolene and Bilveer in terms of the ideological schism between the two. I find the groups in Southeast Asia to be much more fluid. When you defect from JI to the Islamic State, as Abu Bakr Bashir did, there were no real consequences. The families were not killed. There was not excommunication. It was just a much more fluid environment. I just don't find Southeast Asian militants to be as doctrinaire and ideological as some of their co-religionists. And my guess is right now, JI is regaining strength. We see the Indonesian security forces start to take them very seriously once again. So far in 2021, you've had almost as many arrests of members of JI as the JAD. So this is of concern. But I think should the JAD really weaken, I think JI would be poised to absorb those networks back into them. And I just see a lot more fluidity in the region than we might see in other parts of the world.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. Now, I want to delve into sort of, the question of the impact that the global war on terror had on the action strategies and approaches of extremist groups themselves. It's clear from what Bilveer and Jolene said that there has been, for predating 9/11, there was a current that saw Islamic struggles as a part of a global struggle, and I guess that would have its roots in the idea of the Ummah, the global Islamic community as a single unified whole. And of course, the attacks of 9/11 were carried out very much as part of that sort of project. But I wanted to ask, to what extent, by conceiving of a global war against mostly Islamic extremism, the US government unwittingly pushed more radical Islamist groups and extremist groups in Southeast Asia to conceive of their struggles in explicitly global terms. I mean, did the United States end up creating the monster that the global war on terror was designed to defeat? Jolene, do you want to maybe start with you? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I think broadly, I was just thinking of what Dr. Abuza was saying, right? In terms of, and let me launch off from there as well. I think between the groups and the operatives who are, and the members of these non-state actors or terrorist groups. So where the groups are concerned, the groups have espoused their statements of ideology. So for me, while I see the schisms there, I completely agree with Dr. Abuza, where he says that operationally on the ground, it is extremely fluid. And we see that manifesting even in the Philippines, where groups would say, regardless of whether they are IS aligned or Al-Qaeda aligned, they would ultimately be fighting with their co-religionists. They would be fighting for the faith. So they would stand in support of what was happening with the Taliban. So while the groups, for me, the division would be, while the groups espouse it in terms and spell it out ideologically, operationally on the ground, the members would be much more fluid. And to answer your question, in terms of whether or not the strategy had unwittingly sort of created a monster in the end, I think for me, at the end of the day, the global war on terror and the narrative was something that the groups were able to hedge and leverage on in order to gain visibility for their cause. And I think it's sort of unfortunately, that's how, for me, the cards would sort of fall on the table. The global war on terror would ultimately be a way through which groups within the region could hedge in order to try and secure and validate their positions within the country. Many of the terrorist group operatives within the region, at the end of the day, were looking at more nationalist and ethno-nationalist or nationalist sphered vision. So even if you're looking at the groups in southern Thailand, the aim was not entirely global. The aim was very much within the geographical sphere. But what the transnational nature of what had transpired, what had happened through time and as history unfolded with it being transnational in nature, it sort of aggregated membership from both, say, for example, Southern Philippines going over to fight in Indonesia, Indonesians going to fight in Southern Philippines, then going abroad to train. I think how history sort of unfolded and the avenues as how the cards played out. Unfortunately, what it stacked up was them having global vision, but localized operational strategies.
All right, interesting. Bilveer or Zachary, do you have anything to add to that?
Can I come in? Thank you. Thank you very much. Excellent question. I think from the you asked for with regard to the groups. I think first thing is when you look at the counter from the government point of view, the GWOT was actually, it opened up a resource bank in many ways, training, funding, and so on and so forth, and as well as political and diplomatic capital. So that's on one side. But I think more important with regard to your question, I think we must first be cautious and careful to assume that actually it was a one-track response. The JI has been divided from within, from the word go, especially after Abdullah Sunkar died. Hence, we have got the pro-Dakwah and pro-bomb faction. So I think the response from both of them was different with regard to GWOT. While the Hambali faction used it and put forward an operational, ideological, united front from within in terms of the far enemy, because of GWOT is the priority, they undertook a series of things. But at the same time, he was not in the majority, but he was in a strategic position to do many things. But as a consequence of that, you actually saw the degrading of the JI from within very early. So the GWOT strategy was taken advantage of at various levels. But at the same time, it was not just a plus always. It also actually weakened and undermined them. And we see that up to today. So people are, no one is crying Hambali is going to say if he's going to be executed tomorrow in Guantanamo or wherever, because he was in a minority eventually. The dangerous people are not people like Hambali. It's like Abu Rushdam and Abu Tulur and so on and so forth, because these are the guys who decided to play what Jolene said, the game of Idat. They wanted to play a much more longer term because they thought in the Indonesian setting, never before have you used armed struggle and win except in the Revolution War. So they wanted to play by a totally different play kit or playbook. So I think the JWOT actually had a fundamental impact, but it played out differently for different groups. And I think we are still watching it. And today, following Afghanistan, the rise of Taliban, how this will be responded is interesting. Jolene mentioned about JAS. Sure, there's euphoria, but I think at the same time, others are watching what exactly, is this a Taliban or is this actually a vanished Taliban which has made deal with the West? I think these are kind of things which are also taking place in various chat groups, and hence we need to watch. But I think your question is excellent, because I think immediately the far enemy became very clear openly, which many people talked about, hey, this is a very dangerous group, which they were. But within the JI, there were other discourses and narratives which were often missed by many analysts and or purposely ignored because it did not serve your purpose.
All right. So I want to move now to the question of how the global war on terror affected the trajectory of US relations with Southeast Asian nations. Particular the unilateralism of the Bush administration and the various other excesses of the war on terror. How did these impact these nations' relationship with the United States? I mean, I know simply from my focus on Cambodia that the global war on terror, the first decade of the global war on terror, coincided with perhaps the warmest relations between Prime Minister Hun Sen's government and Washington, as Hun Sen was able to, pivot to a sort of a counter-terror posture. Obviously, there were some challenges on this front in Cambodia. Hambali spent time in Cambodia, and so there was a legitimate concern here. But it also did offer, a way of reframing Cambodian relations with the U.S. in a way that downplayed questions of democratization and human rights, which had previously and have since been dominant. So, Zach, I think we might start with you, given that you're in Washington.
And created a counterterrorism organization headed by Hun Manet.
Right. Yes, exactly. So do you have any, other thoughts about how, how the broader trajectory, post-Cold War trajectory of U.S. relations with Southeast Asia was affected by this pivot towards counterterrorism and the rubric that framed American policy of the region?
Yeah, I have very mixed feelings about this. Look, on the one hand, the Bush administration's "you're either with us or against us" rhetoric did not go down very well in much of Muslim majority Southeast Asia. I think the Indonesians, after the Bali bombing, clearly changed their tune. And at least the security forces finally had the free rein to do their jobs without the political interference. The government couldn't really endorse this. I think the Indonesians largely resisted America trying to look to them and use them as a model for the Muslim world. They were the largest Muslim democracy that democratized themselves. It didn't take a US invasion. But the Indonesians really resisted that. We see that the sovereignty was just so guarded in this time. Sometimes it was simply the threats of US acting unilaterally that compelled a cooperation. The Strait of Malacca maritime patrols is a very good example of that, where no one really wanted to do it until the Americans said, well, we're going to do it ourselves. And that kind of forced the Malaysians and Singaporeans and Indonesians and later the Thais to cooperate. So there's some things there. The country that probably benefited the most, of course, was the Philippines. They used this very effectively to rekindle the alliance. The Americans had largely left them on their own after the closing of Subic Bay in 1991. The United States becomes a key backer of the Philippine military. We bankroll their counterterrorism efforts. We do to this day, over $50 million a year in counterterrorism assistance, which is a rounding error for the Pentagon, but in the Philippines, that's real money. And unfortunately, we've created a culture of dependence there. But overall, I think the region benefited from the fact that America did not intervene directly, that we were consumed by 2 land wars, and we're more or less willing to work with the local governments without being too overbearing.
Bilveer, Jolene, do you have any?
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think I generally agree with Jess. I go back to the big framework which I have about Muslim majority and Muslim minority states. I think the Muslim majority states were cautious. This whole idea of with me or against me, I think was very dangerous for the Muslim majority states, both Malaysia, Indonesia in particular, and partly because of this democratizing thing, partly because of the powerful terror extremist Muslim civil society groups which were operating in Indonesia. Partly, don't forget, they are recovering from 30 years of Suharto's repression. So you have to be very, very careful that you don't want the Americans, in the name of terrorism, to allow them to go back and take liberty with their liberties. So I think that's important. But what is interesting, and I think I share with Jess here, how Muslim minority states were actually able to align with the United States. And in the process, they were able to use that leverage and win tremendously on many, many fronts. You talk about the Philippines. I think I will look at Singapore. Our highly proactive reaction and response, because this was something we could do. I mean, the Muslims just constitute 16%. And anyway, the terror group threat is not as serious as others. So we were among the most proactive. Of course, we identified the JI first one, and our actions were very strong. We managed to neutralize them. But in the process of being a leader friend in the region, we did many other things. We signed a framework agreement eventually. We signed the FTA with the United States. George Bush visited Singapore twice in his presidency. So I think we were able to use the GWOT, become a model friend, and in the process, benefited tremendously. So what I will underline and underscore is this. There are 10 states in Southeast Asia. Each and every one responded differently, benefited differently and suffered differently. So I think dangerous to talk about one stroke which affected everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that seems to make sense to me. Jolene, would you like to add anything to Zach and Bilveer's comments?
I think I completely agree that in terms of benefiting differently and as well as learning differently, I think across ASEAN, lessons learned also would have differed between and among states. But I also want to underscore the importance of the fact that with the influx of funding for counterterrorism, there is often this question, and I think it was underscored, what I am personally usually worried about will be the culture of dependence, which is extremely important. We see all that playing out in Afghanistan, and that is where we're often sometimes in the spirit of assistance, well-meaning though it may be, the challenge would be creating that culture of dependence. So if there is no funding injection, then what happens to the dynamic? What happens to the sustenance of structures, especially when you're thinking about structures where counterterrorism is sort of positioned? So those, to me, would be the two important aspects, especially this notion of the culture of dependence. And while we collectively, as ASEAN, we learn and took away from the engagement relatively differently as well.
Sebastian, sorry, I got one very important point. I missed it.
Sure.
I think when you're talking about GWOT, if you are going to be military-based, military-oriented, then I think you're not going to win this war. This war, the sources and causes are actually elsewhere: economic, political, social, repression, suppression. So if you want to do a GWOT, the military thing is important. You need to neutralize these guys who are carrying guns. But I think you also need to build something else. I mean, the big word is nation building. So I think Jolene's point about culture of dependence is very important. But at the same time, where do you boost and build up those grievances? Because it is grievances which push people up there. No one is born a terrorist or extremist. You become one over time. So if the United States want to go in, or anybody want to go in, I think the scanning of what caused this and where are the roots, where do you unroot and uproot these issues, which is the source of all this, I think is very important. I think the United States failed quite badly there, particularly in Afghanistan, but I think we in the region too got a long way to go, because you cannot on one hand in the name of counterterrorism go around doing extrajudicial killing and still continue to support the majority against the minority. You can't. The war will not be over. Somebody else will come up with a new narrative of a new enemy, and the terrorism will continue. So you need this whole of society approach to overcome this so-called issue of extremism and terrorism.
Right, and that actually sort of bridges quite well to my last question, which we'll conclude with, is the U.S. has made much about, or certain people in the U.S. foreign policy making establishment have described the withdrawal from Afghanistan as a way of reconcentrating strategic resources on the challenge posed by China. And of course, Southeast Asia is a very important part of that competition, given its proximity to China. Are there lessons? Bilvir, you spoke about the the overemphasis on security and military operations in the global war on terror, and this has been something that some Southeast Asian governments have been concerned about with regard to the American policy toward China, that it's very much focused on security and less about other issues. Are there lessons that the United States can or should draw from the global war on terror, the successes, the failures, that can inform its, the way that it approaches the challenge posed by China in Southeast Asia? Obviously, China and, the challenge posed by China and, non-state extremist groups are very different, but, are there common lessons here that can be drawn?
Can I say something just to continue what I said earlier? I think
yes, of course.
Excellent point to talk about. I mean, for us, the elephant in the room is China today. So how are we going to deal with this monster who is rising in power on a daily basis, and whose power is not just military? His power is economic, social, technology, cultural, innovation, and even more important, it uses its networks, which has been here for, hundreds or thousands of years. So, and China is walking distant. It had land borders, sea borders, air borders. So I won't say the threat, the asymmetrical presence of China, and one which is so sophisticated, is so overbearing. So overbearing. I live in a Chinese majority country, sure, multiracial, but Chinese majority. And you cannot come and say, okay, I'm going to replace the Chinese with the Americans. It's not going to work. So the Chinese are very sophisticated. I think the sophistication sometimes is often missing. The suaveness is often missing in the American. The lesson learned from Afghanistan, I think America must redeploy its resources there, here, definitely. But the manner of redeployment, its use is not going to be like in the past, because people do not like to see aircraft carrier just running around here. It's much more than that. I ask you one question. We in the region always ask this $6 million question. What does the United States and the West have to offer to us today? In the past, a lot, but today, I think once you can answer that question, I think you'll break the puzzle. And I think America has a lot to offer. But unfortunately, the signals from the top, the way you ran away from Afghanistan after all the investment, all the casualties. I mean, I ask you, do we trust you today? What is the trust deficit about in the coming months, coming years? And these are questions so significant because we've been through so much. So tomorrow, if we join you to say counter or contain China, and then you pack your bags and you move on, what's going to happen to us? So these are things which is going through each and every one of us. So I think America has a lot to learn. Can you build confidence and trust in you by redeploying your resources here? If you can, you will need a united front strategy to win the scholars, to win the people, to win the economic community, to win the military community, the intelligence community, and so on and so forth, and the religious community, which is such an important part of our life, Muslims and non-Muslims. Then you got a long way to go. If you're going to be cutting and chopping, I tell you, which the Chinese are not, then you have a full budget of litany of things to be done, and you may not win, in the longer run.
Zach, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah. Where America really failed in the war on terror was the way that we undermined our moral authority. We undermined our own values. I cannot think of anything that was more deleterious to US efforts than our inability to figure out how to deal with terrorism suspects, locking people up and for decades after putting them in CIA black sites, authorizing torture, the treatment of prisoners at Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo. This was very damaging to the United States, and we never really recovered. And I think we really failed in that. And it's so important. Every country is going to vacillate between security and their values. And we just can't have that wild pendulum swing. And I think as we move forward and think about the competition posed by China, values really matter. We really do need to stand for something that is not an authoritarian regime, that is not out fundamentally undermining the rule of law, that is not undermining civil society, that is not supporting corrupt, kleptocratic regimes throughout the region. And I think if America goes back to a foreign policy that is based more on values and what we really do stand for, that's going to serve us very well. But let me just counter one thing about Bilveer, and that Bilveer said, and I understand there should be a lot of concern from partners and allies when America walks away from Afghanistan. And whether you agree with the decision to withdraw, that's a good, honest debate that we can have. We can all agree that the lack of planning and the chaotic nature of it really was shocking and undermined US credibility. But at the end of the day, Afghanistan has almost nothing to offer the United States. Don't forget, Southeast Asia is over a $2 trillion economy. We are tied to them. Our global supply chains run through Southeast Asia. So I don't think there's any cause for concern that America's walking away. We're really trying to deepen our commitment there. There are issues. Of course, we need the TPP. There has to be an economic foundation to it, and we don't have the political will, but we'll get there.
All right, Jolene, would you like to, add some thoughts to that before we wind things up?
I think from my perspective, when we're looking at engagement or this notion of containment, I think within the region, I always choose to think many players coming together as we sort of balancing the situation, sometimes having to engage economically, understanding the moral compasses that are present in some of these decision makings, as well as trying to balance from the political remit. So to me, it's all about the notion of balance moving forward, understanding what has happened in the past in terms of retrospection, but in terms of trying to build, be it more resilient economies or more resilient policies moving forward.
All right, thank you. Well, I think we'll wind things up there. I'd like to thank our three panelists for tuning in, at awkward times in each place. And I'm sure, our audience has very much appreciated your insights. For those who've tuned in, if you're interested, if you found this discussion interesting, please check out our other panels on East Asia and Central Asia. I'm sure you'll find them very illuminating. And otherwise, I'd like to say goodbye to our three panelists and wish them all the best. And thank you again for all of your insights.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right.